Welcome back to the Art of Citizenry podcast. I'm Manpreet Kaur Kalra, and today we're picking up with our series of episodes decoding the Private Equity Playbook, where we examine how private equity is making all our lives just a little bit worse. So today's episode is a special one for my collaborator, Anna Canning, and I, as we're both sometimes crafters, aka we dabble.
That's right. And today we're going to talk about one of the most dramatic stories to hit the craft world this year, the bankruptcy of Joann Fabrics. Or Joann, I guess it technically was when it went under.
The chain went through a list of names in its long history, dropping the, quote, fabrics from Joann in 2018 to suggest that they were, in fact, about all types of crafts, not just fabric ones, I guess.
Yeah, and before we dive into the history, I have to say I was a bit surprised to see the outpouring of emotion for what I think of as just like a big box store.
I'll mention my mom talks not infrequently about how difficult things are now that there is no Joann, especially when she's looking for yarn to knit or cloth to make an apron or something else.
Aw, I'm sorry for your mom. I hope she can find something new.
Rip Joann.
I know. As I was doing research for this episode, right? So I'm like pouring through, bankruptcy articles, all of this stuff. And then I came also upon this whole thread of tributes to Joann Fabrics from the big cosplay convention Dragon Con. So this year there were just like all these photos of little shrines with like candles in loving memory and like Joann RIP. One had a sign proclaiming their look. This person was like all dressed up, and it was like Joann, Our Lady of Crafts. And then another was like Saint Joann de Fabrique. It's amazing.
I love this. These are so great and definitely worth the search, in my humble opinion. I guess I've also just never asked the question, who was Joann anyway?
Well, at the beginning, there actually never was a person named Joann.
Dun, dun, dun.
Dun, dun, dun. Instead, the company started as the Cleveland Fabric Shop in Cleveland, Ohio in 1943. And it was a family business founded by members of the Reich, Rohrbach, and Roskam families who fled the Nazis in Germany to come to the U.S. and then to Cleveland. And at that time, Cleveland was actually home to one of the largest apparel manufacturing centers in the U.S. after New York City. So the store grew into multiple locations throughout Ohio over the next 2 decades. And then in 1963, looking to expand beyond the state, the business was renamed, blending the names of the daughters from 2 of the founding families, Joan and Jackie Ann, into the new company name of Joann Fabrics.
Very crafty of them, I must say. I do love a good history rabbit hole, so thank you for that. I've always thought of Cleveland as the Rust Belt, right? Like with steel as the main industry, but turns out garment manufacturing or ready-to-wear clothing was actually the second largest industry there. Peaking in the 1920s, the workers were largely Jewish immigrants from Germany and Eastern Europe, and the factories were mostly unionized, with several sources noting that they had better working conditions than New York's factories. And for anyone who doesn't know, New York at the time was the leading domestic garment manufacturing hub. And so that's pretty interesting to think about. We've got unions, we've got like positive factory conditions or better than factory conditions. So, this is an interesting time, and I think it's an interesting context for us to have around Cleveland.
Yeah, this was news to me and fascinating labor history as well. And, the history of Joann Fabrics is so intertwined, both with that place and then the history also of both fashion and the role of women in society. So when that first Cleveland store opened in 1943, World War II was going on, and there were wartime restrictions on clothing, and especially women's clothing. So there were government pamphlets teaching people how to make, do, and mend. I've actually got a couple of them because I find them fascinating. And so, women were encouraged to sew for their families, and there was like a whole line of sewing patterns that had been adapted to meet strict limits on how much fabric was used. It is fascinating to me the level of detail that the War Production Board, which is the one that like put together these restrictions, went to. That there's like prescriptions on the length and width of skirts that you could make. They outlawed pleats, ruffles, full sleeves, basically anything that would use unnecessary fabric was off limits.
Yeah, it's so easy to think of fabric store as simply a retail space, but in the 1940s, it was woven into a much bigger story about gender, labor, and I suppose national identity. The wartime restrictions you describe didn't just shape fashion, they reshaped the daily lives of women who were expected to stretch every resource as far as possible. So it makes sense how Joann Fabrics could have a bit of a post war boom in that way. It's a reminder that the history of a seemingly simple craft store is actually bound up with the evolution of domestic labor, the politics of fabric and fashion, and the shifting expectations placed on women in mid century America.
Which brings us to one of my favorite weird stories of, this post-war time. It's actually about Singer Sewing Machine Company. So sewing, still in the craft vein, right? So in the late 1960s, Singer was experiencing a huge sales slump, right? Like fewer people were sewing, ready-made clothing was becoming more of a thing. And if you're a young person, the culture of learning to sew and I don't know, like be a good wife, outfit your family, all of that, that's waning. So Singer launches this new ad campaign, sponsoring a series of rock and roll concerts, issuing records, and even a Singer brand record player.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I know, right? Like sewing, it's rock and roll.
Making it exciting.
That's right. So I actually have one of the records from this time, and it has on the cover, it's Singer presents Elvis singing Flaming Star and Others. And it was issued for sale only at select stores where Singer products were available. And it was all the lead up to the main event, which was a Singer-sponsored NBC TV special featuring Elvis for Christmas of 1968. And I know, right? It makes for a good, weird story. But it did not turn around Singer's sales. So it's probably a story for another episode, but Singer ended up also getting flipped through this whole series of private equity controlled deals.
Surprise, surprise.
And, if you pick up a sewing machine manufactured at various points throughout the last 50 years, you can really tell, like, just by the heft and make of the machine, exactly when, like, private equity really started cutting corners in that industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And, ultimately making machines so much cheaper. The most recent way I've seen a Singer sewing machine is as decor in a store. What is it called? All Saints? All Saints. They have Singer sewing machines as their decor.
Okay.
But, the story actually also reminds me of my grandmother who had a Singer machine back in India. And my mom still fondly remembers it and talks about it every now and then. And it really was a tool of utility, right? Making and mending clothing for the family. And it also makes me reflect, actually, thinking about sewing machines more broadly, about my mom's sewing machine, which is this very old sewing machine that she got when she first moved to America, and she still uses it. I would say that when she first got this machine, it was used to make clothes and other necessities for me as a child. As children of immigrants, not everything was easy to just go to the store and get. So she would make things for us at home. And also, South Asian clothing wasn't readily available and wasn't really affordable because of just bringing it from India is very expensive. So, my mom used to sew us clothing and South Asian clothes and so forth. So that sewing machine was purely a tool of utility. And till this day, in fact, the apron I use is made by my mom using her sewing machine with fabric from Joann. So I think about how these stories are so interconnected, and sewing machines, I suppose, are, part of the crafty sector. So there we have it.
Yeah, I love how you start telling these stories. And then it immediately goes into like the role of family and the
Right?
connections and culture and all of this. All these things.
There's so many different threads, and all these pieces start coming together, and you realize how interconnected it all is.
For sure. And I mean, what it reminds me of is, so, my mom's an artist and she's always been into sewing and like making things as self-expression.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. When she was in her teens, she apparently sewed herself a full velvet dress to go to, yes, the Doors. And this story is like so much of that time, right? Like, not just because she's, made herself a dress, got her false eyelashes, she's on her way to see Jim Morrison. But, we also see how in the US market, at least, sewing is becoming a bit more of a creative outlet instead of just pure utility. At that time, that would have been, I guess, late 60s, early 70s.
It seems like Joann managed to ride a lot of these waves, right? Like the year after the Singer Sewing Machine and Elvis Christmas collab, Joann Fabrics has 169 stores across 28 states. That's also the year that the company became a publicly traded company under the official name of Fabry Centers of America. So throughout the 70s, the company continues to expand massively, opening their 500th store in the 1980s. That's a lot of stores. That's a lot of Joann.
Yeah, for real. But that growth is not just because Joann cracked, some secret code that Elvis couldn't crack for Singer. Instead, as fewer people were sewing, department stores, five and dime stores, drugstores, they were all shrinking and eliminating their fabric sections. Like, it used to be that you could go into any of those places and buy fabric, notions, all of that stuff. But between 1977 and 1983, the number of retail fabric outlets declined almost 50%. And, Joann Fabric was there to capture that market share. So they jumped in on that transition, that was taking place both in the fabric market, but then also, Main Street shops closing down and moving to more of like a shopping malls and strip mall with bigger and bigger stores that was happening across the retail sector at that time.
Yeah, top executives from Joann refer to the 1970s as the glory days. And when you look at the numbers, you can see exactly why. By 1983, the chain had over 600 stores across 33 states, operating under a few different names. And between 1979 and 1985, so many dates over here, both sales and profits just about doubled, hitting 226.9 million in sales in 1985, making it the number 2 fabric retailer in the country.
But those glory days didn't last. So up until then, selling fabric had historically been a recession-resistant line of business. Right. So when times were hard, women would turn to fabric stores to save money by making their clothes. Joann Fabric got their start during wartime, after all.
Mm-hmm.
But when a recession hit in the 1980s, things were different. So, the ready-to-wear clothing business had also been changing over the last decades, and apparel manufacturing had been moving from these union-dense, relatively high-wage places like Ohio, first to the southern United States, and then south of the border, and then overseas. And this flight to places with lower wages gave clothing brands a little more leeway. And so, they slashed their prices as this recession hit. And suddenly making your own clothes wasn't the money-saving project that it had always been.
This sounds like a topic you and I have talked about quite a bit over the past. Globalization, exploitative wages, and manufacturing conditions. And, basically the foundation of fast fashion. So,
Yep.
a quick digression. What you're describing is such a critical moment in the story, and zooming out, a turning point for how we relate to clothing today. In just a few short years, we've gone from making your own clothes as a way to save money, with a sewing machine as a precious tool to make it easier, to the early days of fast fashion turning that on its head. So, when apparel manufacturing moved from unionized, high wage regions like Ohio to places like India, Bangladesh, etc., it fundamentally rewired the economics of clothing. It became cheaper, trend cycles accelerated, and disposability became kind of the norm. It was no longer like, oh, I have this article of clothing. I want to make sure I preserve it, keep it good, like mend it, keep it going, invest in the longevity of it, right? So, with t shirts and dresses priced lower than the fabric you need to make them, sewing shifted from a practical skill to more of a hobby or a form of creative expression. And I would almost argue that today it can be seen as an expensive hobby, given the cost of fabric yardage, right? Regardless, as we've talked about in the past, globalization amplified these dynamics, creating vast supply chains built on layers of subcontracting and invisibility. This global race to the bottom didn't just happen by accident. It was the predictable outcome of an economic model that treats labor as a cost to be minimized. And again, women were the most impacted, except in this case, it was women abroad, their labor exploited, essentially out of sight.
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel like this is a theme that we keep coming back to. It's interesting to hear you say that because I feel like the cost of labor is going to become a piece also in Joann's stores. You know, as the decade followed, it was pretty brutal actually, both for Joann Fabrics and really the whole industry. On the plus side, for Joann, the company kept buying up competitors, adding more and more and more stores until by the mid to late 90s, there were really just two fabric giants left. Joann Fabric and Hancock Fabrics. But despite the increasing number of stores, the other financial indicators kept trending down, with the company taking on more debt to fuel its expansion and continuing to slash prices to try to win shoppers back, both from their competitors and to adapt to the emerging fast fashion economy. In this time, Joann Fabrics also started diversifying its offerings. So instead of just focusing on fabric and people who might be making clothes, the company began to stock up on all sorts of craft supplies, holiday decorations, home decor, and all this stuff. By the mid-90s, it made up about a third of the chain's annual sales.
Yeah, in the mid 90s, the chain was starting to look a lot like the Joann that we knew up until this year, right? In 1995, it opened the first of its, quote, superstores, a massive 46,000 square foot store. That's a lot of craft material for anyone over here, near its Ohio headquarters. So that's something like 4/5 of a football field of just craft supplies, fabric, and so much more. Joann is such a tale of contradictions. On one hand, in the mid 90s, the company settled with the Securities and Exchange Commission for $3 million for having misstated earnings. And part of the reason was that they didn't have real-time inventory linked to sales. They just took sales numbers from the register and estimated what they figured profits might be, which sounds incredibly absurd and quite crafty for what I feel like appears to be a legit business. Just a few years later, in 1997, the company launched Joann.com, just as e-commerce was taking off, with the first secure online transaction having taken place in 1994. For context, that's the same year that auctionweb.com rebranded as eBay. And 2 years later, in 1995, Bezos launched Amazon to sell books. Yeah, back in the day. And a year later, PayPal launched. So we're talking Windows 95 era here.
Wow, I'm still mind boggled that you have like this old timey register technology going on. And then at the same time, it's like, and now the World Wide Web.
Can you imagine? They were like estimating their profits on the basis of a cash register and still managed to launch an e-commerce website in the early days. Like, it just blows my mind. It's very crafty. I'm going to come
Very
back to
crafty.
that. It's very crafty.
This is becoming a really like a theme here. But, okay, so we're at this point up in the mid to late 90s, right? And things are once again up and down for Joann. On the one hand, they're expanding, upgrading their stores, more and more going to these superstore like football scale formats. But they continue to have growing pains with infrastructure, right? As their inventory systems weren't always able to keep up with growth. So in 2001, the company kicked off a recovery plan, which was focused on, really nailing it with their high performing stores, closing the ones that weren't working, cutting products that weren't selling, and instead focusing on what was working. So they trimmed that superstore size format down to a more manageable 35,000 square feet.
But I really want a football field of craft supplies. Like, I feel like that is what we need in the world. More football fields of craft supplies.
We're going to have to make that dream happen. So in this new, slightly smaller, but still massive superstore layout, they then standardized that layout. So they put fabric in the middle of the store and arranged it around fabric cutting tables with this vision that this area would act as a community center, where customers came not just to get their fabric cut by employees, but, there would be like people gathering and chatting about their projects, and it would have like a, community vibe.
And that recovery plan actually worked. In just 2 years, the company went from posting losses to returning to profitability by their 60th anniversary in 2003.
Yeah, so all of these measures that Joann was taking was helping them get back on track. But there were also outside trends that were helping as well. So I was reading a New York Times article from 2002 that had the headline, "Investing. Arts and crafts stores defy the retail slump." And the article talks about the big boost in sales that Joann, as well as, competitors like Michaels, got from the stay-at-home trend that followed the September 11th terrorist attacks. And, there's this fascinating bit of foreshadowing on the history of Joann Fabric that the company published for their 60th anniversary that comments on this macro trend, right? And so it's, it waxes on, right? Like people are returning in droves to home-based, high-touch activities like needlework, crafts, gardening, and floral design, handmade gifts, and home decorating projects. In the 2-year period from 2000 to 2002 alone, industry-wide crafts and hobby revenue rose from an already healthy $23 billion to $29 billion. And studies show that 60% of Americans in 2002 participated in some kind of craft activity, up from 54% in 2000. And, that statement implies to me that either they think or they're trying to convince you, the reader and potential investor, that this post-terrorist attack stay-at-home trend is here to stay and that these year-on-year growth numbers will continue. And it reminds me a lot of what we've seen in this industry more recently coming out of the pandemic. Spoiler alert.
Absolutely. I mean, this is why I find studying the past so valuable. The pandemic crafty boom is really a case of history repeating itself. So here in the early 2000s, we see Joann Fabrics doing really well. Sales are going up again. They're growing, albeit the razor thin margins. In 2005, they break ground on a third massive distribution center to avoid the inventory challenges that they had last time they did a big growth spurt, right? So now we're like, okay, we learned from the past. We're going to address it. We're going to create a new distribution center. And so in 2006, the company hired its first non-family CEO. And from the press coverage, it sounds like he does a good job managing growth, keeping the business on track, staying out of debt, and all that good stuff. So from what I've read, this is actually not a story where a business was floundering in the lead up of a private equity firm buying it.
Dun, dun, dun. Fast forward to 2010, when the private equity firm Leonard Green and Partners enters the scene with an unsolicited offer to buy the publicly traded company and take it private. So Leonard Green brings a $1.6 billion offer to buy up all the shares and make Joann a private company owned by Leonard Green. And the company says yes. So Daryl Green, the CEO at the time, says, going private will enable Joann to expand faster and boost its share of fabric and craft sales. And you know how much I love delving deep into the archives of local newspapers.
Oh, do I ever?
So I was poking around in the Cleveland Plain Dealer from that time, and they have some experts weighing in on this, what is big local news, right? So they have this guy, Robert Antal, a partner with Consumer Centric Consulting LLC out of Shaker Heights, Ohio. And he says, Leonard Green owns and has owned many prominent retailers in the US. His firm knows retail and has done a pretty good job of improving the businesses they have owned, unlike some other less astute investors who have purchased retail companies. The biggest risk, says this analyst, is, if they borrow too much money and the business fails to meet expectations, there can be problems meeting the debt obligations. But Leonard Green's track record is so good that I wouldn't expect that to happen in this case. Well, we started this episode talking about Joann's bankruptcy, so I'm guessing the irony of this is already pretty apparent.
I would love to go through this track record.
Right? Okay, so the article goes on to list off Leonard Green and Partners' track record. And we'll just say that with the hindsight of 2025, the list does not look so good. We'll get into it. There's Sports Authority.
Bankrupt in 2016.
The Container Store.
Bankrupt in 2024.
Dave's Bridal.
Bankrupt twice in 5 years, though it changed hands somewhere in there as well.
Cool. Whole Foods.
Sold after 2 years for a substantial profit, so all right. Well done.
Neiman Marcus.
Bankrupt in 2020.
J. Crew.
Also bankrupt in 2020.
Okay, so 5 of the 6 companies named in that article have gone bankrupt, which of course raises the question, who is Leonard Green and Partners, and why do they have such a track record of running companies into the ground?
Well, Leonard Green and Partners is a private equity firm founded by, you guessed it, Leonard Green. In 1989, the biographies of Leonard Green on the internet repeat 2 key points over and over. He was a patron of the arts and went on to head the Los Angeles Opera, and he was a pioneer of the leveraged buyout industry and founder of the largest leveraged buyout firm in the West. So quite the diverse resume, I must add.
Indeed. And one of Leonard Green's biggest deals at, the firm Leonard Green and Partners was the massive roll-up of Thrifty Payless drugs with Rite Aid, which then formed the largest drugstore chain in the West in the mid-90s and netted his firm a handsome profit. The actual details of that deal came out in the course of Green's 2000 divorce proceedings, as his soon-to-be ex-wife accused him of insider trading in the course of that deal. He did go on to sue her in a $25 million defamation suit for saying that, so I should probably add that as a legal disclaimer. The divorce proceedings also made public Green's monthly budget, and it is amazing.
I love these kind of things. Tell me more.
So as of April 2001, his gross monthly income was $435,876, which comes out to about $800,000 per month in 2025 money.
Oh my gosh.
And
wow.
His expenses, I'm going to go through these. Let's take a minute because it really gives you a sense for how much money moves to the top in this private equity world, right?
Mm-hmm.
So his expenses included a $211,000 a month on mortgages on homes in Malibu and Aspen, Colorado. spends nearly $9,000 a month on clothes, $1,190 per month on golf, $1,122 per month on wine and liquor. The grand finale for me is $946 per month on cigars and $474 per month on charity. That's right. The alleged philanthropist spends more than 4 times as much on booze and cigars as he spends on charity. So putting it in 2025 dollars, just so you can compare it to your rent, that would be just shy of $3,800 per month in the booze and cigar budget line.
And don't forget his $4.75 million art collection or the $7 million Gulfstream jet. So, last episode, we touched on how the founder of the private equity firm, Freeman Spogli, was a big Republican donor, particularly to the Bush dynasty. Well, Green and his firm, on the other hand, have donated pretty exclusively to Democrats. And that, to me, just underscores the fact that the close ties with deep private equity pockets is really a bipartisan project.
Absolutely. And it has taken bipartisan support to help rig the rules that allow guys like Leonard Green to get so absurdly rich gambling with other people's money. Because that is truly the definition of what a leveraged buyout is.
So let's get into what exactly a leveraged buyout is using the example of Leonard Green and Partners and their purchase of Joann Fabrics. So a leveraged buyout is a key part of the private equity playbook. Most simply, it's when a company is purchased mostly using borrowed money rather than the buyer's own funds, loans that end up on the balance sheet of the company being bought.
Okay, so in this case, Joann Fabrics is literally going into debt so that Leonard Green and Partners can buy the company.
That's right. Yeah. So when Leonard Green and Partners made that $1.6 billion offer, only a very small amount of the money actually came from funds that Leonard Green and Partners had raised. It was a private deal, so we're not privy to exactly what the terms of the deal are or exactly how much debt was put onto Joann's books. But by extrapolating from information that is available, for example, from the various public pension funds that invested in LGP, the estimate is that Leonard Green capped their initial equity investment in the company at around 10% of the fund's overall value. The value of the fund in question was $5.3 billion. So it's estimated that Leonard Green didn't spend any more than $530 million, or about 1/3 of the $1.6 billion purchase price.
Wow. So what that means in practice is that Leonard Green had some skin in the game, but really not all that much.
Yeah, and so 1.6 billion minus 530 million equals 1,070 million, which is a best guess estimate of how much debt Joann Fabrics was left carrying.
And so part of what is making all of this feasible is what's going on in the outside world again, right? And in 2011, interest rates were hitting historic lows.
That's right. Yeah. Coming out of the Great Recession in 2008, the federal funds rates, that is the interest rate at which banks lend to one another, was about as low as it can go, hovering between 0 and 0.25%. Part of the gamble was likely that the debt sitting on Joann's balance sheet was about as close to free money as you can get.
So the calculation would be that, if Leonard Green could then sell the company for even just like half of what they paid for it down the line, it'll still be profitable for them as they've only got maybe $530,000 of their own money invested.
I'll underline that these numbers are all loose estimates, right? So I would say that the overall logic of how a leveraged buyout works, that checks out. Yeah.
Okay. So here we are then. Joann Fabric goes from having $0 in debt to probably over $1 billion of debt overnight.
Sounds like a great deal, right?
Right. So instead of just having to sell enough product to cover the costs of keeping the lights on, buying products, paying workers, rent, they also then have to cover payments on those loans.
Yeah. And, another part of this is they now owe Leonard Green management fees. So later SEC filings showed that Joann Fabrics was paying Leonard Green $5 million per year in management fees. And on top of that, as interest rates started to go up through the 2010s, that means that debt got more and more expensive.
Which then means that Joann had to sell more and more and more and more product and cut more corners. They had to swim harder, basically, to keep from sinking with these twin weights of management fees and interest rates dragging the company down. And, it had always been a business that had fairly slim margins.
Absolutely. And, in the 2010s, that's exactly what happened. Throughout the first 60 years as a company, Joann Fabrics was run by members of the founding family. Shortly after Leonard Green and Partners bought the company, then CEO Darrell Webb stepped down from his role, taking a seat on the board. Over the next decade, a series of CEOs went on to run the business. Fortune wrote a story on the demise of Joann Fabrics, which has a particularly telling story about one of those CEOs, Jill Solto, who was brought in as CEO in 2015. She brought in consultants from McKinsey to analyze the stores and workforce, which resulted in mass layoffs.
Such classic consultant advice, get efficient, have fewer workers, do more, which is also a sheet out of the Private Equity Playbook. But here's the thing, right? Selling fabric isn't exactly an efficient business. We were talking earlier about what worked in Joann Fabrics' earlier recovery plan in the early 2000s. And part of it was focusing in on the cutting table at the center of the store and hiring lots of people who were themselves sewers and crafters. So slashing those people's jobs meant that not only was there less helpful conversation, there were also fewer people to help you. Right? Like fabric isn't one of those things that comes ready cut like a can in the grocery store. Instead you have to wait for someone to unspool the fabric on the table, measure it, cut off the length you want. And then sometimes there's someone in front of you with a big or an elaborate project, stacks of bolts, lots of different measurements to cut, right? Like it all takes time. I absolutely remember, standing in line for like 30 minutes in this era to get like one little thing cut and then just being like, whatever, and leaving. And it sounds like that was not an uncommon experience, right? Like sales started to take a hit in this era.
Yeah, and part of the story definitely feels like it's a story of how top management is really just focused on the bottom line. Selling yards of fabric is different from selling boxes of cereal off a shelf, right? They are approaching the company with a very cookie cutter sales approach. And there's an anecdote from a vendor in the Fortune story that summed it up honestly really well. Essentially, they say, the higher up in the company that you would go, the less there was an understanding of what the customer actually wanted to do.
Wow. Yeah. And that disconnect clearly had an impact. And then, the other thing that had an impact was the massive debt that Joann was carrying on its books from Leonard Green's leveraged buyout. In November of 2019, the company's debt stood at $1.36 billion. And that's in a year in which its net sales were $2.3 billion. And then the pandemic hit.
Yes, Joann was one of that rare category of businesses for whom the pandemic was actually a, quote, good thing, I suppose, because suddenly we were all stuck at home and we were trying to keep ourselves occupied. And remember those early days of the pandemic when there was this rush to sewing masks because there just weren't enough around?
Oh, do I ever. I personally was at home sorting through my fabric stash and like trying to pick out fabric that would be, the right thickness, walk the line between fun print and embarrassingly unprofessional for people who might have to wear them at work. So, in that era, fabric ironically saved Joann after they had already dropped the fabrics from their name.
Yeah, so Joann decided to cash in on this trend and they started offering bundles of fabrics and they created this whole program called Make to Give, donating mass making materials to people who were going to donate them.
Yeah, now, exactly how altruistic this program was is actually less clear. So, in the early chaos days of the pandemic, Joann's CEO sent out an internal letter telling its workers that hospitals like the Cleveland Clinic had asked them for materials for masks and gowns. So, therefore, they were an essential business that would be staying open. The letter was leaked, and when a reporter with Business Insider asked the Cleveland Clinic about this, they were pretty much like, never heard of this. But, professionally, of course. But the upshot of it was that, while many smaller fabric and yarn shops had to close their doors for months, Joann stayed open in a lot of states.
Yeah, the other thing that was going on was that lots of people were stuck at home, right? This was people's sourdough era, a time in which people were picking up all kinds of crafts. And in March 2021, MarketWatch wrote that Joann had picked up an additional 800 million new customers in the last year, and that they tended to be younger and more affluent than their regular customer base.
Here we go again.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, having just talked our way through this whole history.
False hope is honestly what it is. It's false hope.
Right? Oh, but that doesn't really seem to have been the takeaway of Joann management. Instead, then CEO Wade Micklon told Fortune, fundamentally, there has been a shift for people who want to do more do-it-yourself projects. And he gave this interview as, part of this mini press junket that seemed to be going on, talking about the latest news in 2021, which was Joann was issuing an IPO, an initial public offering. Did he actually believe in this fundamental shift? Or did those at the top just see the frenzy of IPO activity in the market in general, coupled with Joann's good sales numbers and figured, good time for Leonard Green to make its exit? Hard to say. But I will add that Micklon had a past in leadership at Walgreens, where one of his most prominent accomplishments was developing a partnership with the blood testing firm Theranos and continuing to stand by Elizabeth Holmes long after her claims were thoroughly discredited.
Honestly, what you're describing makes me think about how there is seemingly no end in the ways that these men can fail up, and of course, also no way to get inside the heads of executives. Because Leonard Green did not make a complete exit. Despite the IPO, Leonard Green and partners retained a 69% share in the business and a majority on the board. So the IPO generated $131 million, but that fundamental shift the CEO boasted about quickly looked like a little blip. Right. So with a small portion of the IPO going to pay off debt, the company remained heavily debt burdened.
Yeah. And after those first 2 years of the pandemic, people started to get out of the house more and pick up fewer, newer hobbies. So sales started falling. But now, as a publicly traded company, those drops were very visible. So not only did sales go down, but then stocks fell even faster. And in 2023, shares of Joann lost 69% of their value, even as the stock market as a whole was up nearly 20%.
From there, things tumbled downhill really quick, right? In mid-2023, the company was in such dire conditions that it warned that it could be delisted from the stock exchange. And that warning quickly became a reality when the company filed for bankruptcy in 2024, just 3 years after that initial triumphant IPO. The company was then taken private again. And this bankruptcy was focused on restructuring its $615 billion debt, a sum which had become completely unmanageable. But 1 year later, Joann emerged from bankruptcy, having slashed $505 million in debt, but keeping all of its 815 stores open.
But that win was short-lived because less than a year later, in January 2025, Joann filed for bankruptcy again. And, at first there were hopes for a buyer who would continue operations, but that didn't come through. And this time it was, in fact, the end. So all 800 stores would be closing, and all 19,000 people who worked in the stores, in their Ohio-based offices, and in all the distribution centers spread across the country would all be losing their jobs. So the company's assets were purchased out of bankruptcy by GA Group, which is a firm specializing in buying and liquidating companies. And yes, they too are private equity owned. And AG Group, which is a real estate firm who seems to specialize in exactly what they did here, which is taking the leases of a bankrupt retail chain and auctioning them off. And I am restraining myself here, but I will not go down a real estate rabbit hole, although I do find like the endless financialization of real estate and our built environment kind of a mix of fascinating and horrifying.
News coverage of the bankruptcy was really interesting, right? Many mainstream news outlets started out by covering the story of this bankruptcy as just another tale of changing retail trends, inventory problems and declining sales. But the reality is that the company had weathered those issues time and time again in its 82-year history. A key difference here was that the company was trying to weather these factors while dragging a massive debt from the leveraged buyout and the hefty management fees that we talked about earlier.
Right. I can't help asking the question, like, management fees for what? Like, it seems like there's all these stories, right, of top management just being so out of touch with the actual business of selling fabric, of then cutting all of the employees who have the expertise to make it a desirable place to go to buy stuff to do your crafts. It seems like this expensive management has just pretty much one tool in their tool belt, and that is cutting costs. That according to one former Joann general manager, towards the end, stores were being staffed with just 2 people, expected to cover an entire football field scale store.
Yeah, and after all of that, it's still not clear whether Leonard Green and Partners actually made money on this deal. We can piece things together based on disclosures from things like public pension funds. We can trace which fund the Joann Fabrics deal was initially funded through, but that fund was also used for Whole Foods Market, which was one of those very lucky deals where Leonard Green sold fairly quickly and made a lot of money.
Yeah, in a future episode, we'll have to get into more detail on just how that works, right? Like public pension funds, so the retirement money put aside for state and municipal workers is a huge source of cash for private equity firms. And as I've said before, like private equity bosses love to gamble with other people's money. And so as we think about, how we as community members can push back on the private equity takeover of our lives, talking to these public pension fund managers about the consequences of their investments is actually a tactic that has successfully been used by activists. And it turns out that all these private equity fueled bankruptcies have consequences.
Yeah, they really do. And not just for investors. So in a previous episode, I actually had a chance to speak to someone from Private Equity Stakeholder Project regarding immigrant detention centers. Private Equity Stakeholder Project does a great job of compiling just how many job losses are linked to private equity controlled companies. And their data shows that Leonard Green and Partners' leverage buyout tactics are particularly risky, right? Driving more firms into bankruptcy and destroying more jobs than your average private equity firm. And that's all for the sake of profit.
Yeah, and there are other ways that this bankruptcy has rippled out and continues to impact people and the craft sector at large, right? Like a few months after the last Joann stores closed, the Design Group Americas also filed for bankruptcy. DGA, as we'll call them, is the parent company who owns what's often referred to among people who sew as the Big Four sewing pattern companies. So their sewing patterns were primarily sold at Joann. And, while DGA has a lot of brands and products that they sold, Joann reportedly accounted for 5% of their revenue. And their bankruptcy filings noted that they had been particularly hard hit by unpaid invoices tied to customer bankruptcies. And, DGA's other products include things like wrapping paper, bows, gift bags, etc., which is a category hard hit when another of their big customers, Party City, was driven into bankruptcy by, you guessed it, debt from another private equity linked leveraged buyout. And another way that's rippling out is so their paper patterns are upwards of 75% of sewing patterns sold in the US. So smaller independent pattern companies rely on their supply chain. So, like the printing presses, that weird kind of paper to keep their supply chains running.
Mm-hmm.
So if DGA's volume isn't available to keep the presses running the rest of the time, what happens to all those little independent pattern companies?
Yeah, it's not like we can just opt out of private equity's takeover of our economy and our society. I've seen graphics that offer a guide of what is and isn't private equity owned. And the reality is that this isn't an issue where consumer choice can solve the problem, right? These are massive companies and they're intertwined with our lives and the infrastructure on which we rely. And opting out is just really not an option we have.
Yeah, one of the things that has really stuck with me is this juxtaposition of the passion that people expressed about the demise of Joann. That the store has ended up becoming one of the main sources for the supplies need to do creative things for so many people across the country now that, many local fabric stores have closed. And then the people at the top of the store, they can't even be bothered to know what's inside a pattern envelope, let alone staff a store with enough people to actually cut the fabric.
There's just such an utter disconnect there.
Yeah, there really is. And, I get it, the race to the bottom. It's a defining feature of capitalism. Corners have been cut in business ages before the concept of private equity was ever dreamed up. But I think this story really illustrates that these private equity bosses aren't even that good at doing, capitalism in the classic sense where we're talking about competition and a company winning in the marketplace because they're better than their competitors or whatever, right? Instead, what we see is that everything is just getting reduced to financial variables.
Yeah. And when you look at what's happening to Joann through the lens of private equity, it becomes clear that we're not just talking about one struggling retailer or one bad investment strategy. We're talking about a shift in how business is done. While private equity has been around since the 1970s, its growth went into overdrive over the financial crisis of 2007, 2009. And according to a recent article by The Nation, PE firms are widely struggling to exit investments profitably. And the PE sector as a whole is now sitting on some $3 trillion worth of unsellable assets. Joann illustrates one thing in my mind for sure, and that is that private equity and the Private Equity Playbook is about turning businesses into financial instruments, loading them with debt and treating the people who rely on them, workers, customers, local economies, as collateral damage. With that, I want to thank Anna for joining me in conversation and all of you for tuning in. Art of Citizenry is entirely listener-supported. I truly hope you consider contributing to it by visiting artofcitizenry.com/support. Please remember to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and give it 5 stars. Thank you to our producer, Aliana Ray, and editor, Stephen Blevins. Original theme music by Katrina Zemrak.